It's hard to believe, but there was a time when Saddam Hussein was popular with a lot of people in Iraq. He came to power in the 1970s as the man behind the throne of Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, the fourth president of Iraq, and in 1979 pushed an aging al-Bakr out of office and became president himself. Hussein began spending millions of dollars on infrastructure and education. He nationalized Iraq's oil production, which did not please many people outside the country, but gained himself and his country immense wealth. Hussein's vision for Iraq was of a secular Arab republic, which included Syria, with whom he was allied for a time. And to achieve his goals, he was willing to do anything, spend money, and kill or punish millions of people. Welcome to History on Fleek. Today we'll be telling you about the incredibly vicious dictator of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. Hussein was born in Tikrit, Iraq, the town near where he was found in a hole in the ground in 2003 by U.S. troops during the American invasion of Iraq. When Hussein was born, Iraq and much of the rest of the Middle East was controlled by European powers. Iraq was controlled by the British through a puppet king, Faisal II. Neighboring Syria was controlled by the French. In both of these countries, large nationalist movements developed after World War II. Saddam was a Ba'athist, an international party or organization that called for a unified Arab republic running westward from Iraq to Egypt. Some Ba'athists hoped that someday the Middle East and mostly Arab North Africa would be united under their banner. In the second part of the 1950s, Arab nationalism swept the Middle East. The movement's icon was Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, himself an Arab nationalist, and an avowed enemy of Israel, the new Jewish state created in 1948. Arab anti-Semitism was a uniting force in the Arab world, and the Iraqis and Saddam were part of it. On July 14, 1958, General Abd al-Qasim overthrew the Iraqi king and took power himself. Though he was not a Ba'athist, Qasim included them in his cabinet and enjoyed their support for a very short time. In October 1957, a Ba'athist assassination team, which had included an untrained Saddam at the last moment, tried to kill Qasim because he had announced an alliance with the Iraqi Communist Party, at that time a major force, at least in the capital Baghdad. The Communists were opposed to the Ba'athist idea of pan-Arabism, and that put Qasim in the Ba'athist sights. We know that Saddam was one of the men who pulled the trigger, and they thought they had killed Qasim, but had only wounded him. By all independent accounts, Saddam could have killed him, but began to panic and his shots were wild. Believing they had killed Qasim, the Ba'athists fled, only to find out he had survived. Saddam and the others, Hussein, fled to Syria, then to Egypt. 6 members of the killing squad or the plot against Qasim were arrested and sentenced to death, but spent years in prison instead. In Egypt, Saddam finished high school education and pursued a career as a lawyer, but never passed the Egyptian equivalent of the bar exam. One good thing happened for Hussein though. In Egypt, he met one of the founders of the Ba'athist movement, fellow Iraqi Michel Aflaq. He became close to Aflaq and protected him from a purge in the Ba'ath Party after the botched assassination attempt. In 1968, the Ba'ath Party replaced the military as the rulers of Iraq. By the mid-1970s, Saddam was actually a popular figure, at least among many Arabs in the country. He had been put in charge of strengthening the party's position in the country, which he did through internal maneuvering, but also a series of domestic programs, including education and more job opportunities for women. The Ba'athists also limited the role of religion in government and the law. But Iraq wasn't and isn't a completely Arab country, and many of the conservative religious elements in the nation disliked the Ba'athist policies towards religion and women. Moreover, within Iraq, there had long been divisions. Kurdish people wanted independence or autonomy, Sunni against Shia Muslims, clan rivalries and local conflicts, nomad herders against farmers, communists against everyone else, and more. Baathism was a secular pan-Arab movement, and what's more, as time went by, the idea rose in Iraq, mainly with Saddam, that Iraq should be the center of a Ba'athist Arab nation, as he and many others believed that Iraq, home of some of the earliest civilizations in history, was also the birthplace of the Arabs. This frequently put him at odds with his off and on ally Syria, which eventually became an enemy. Baathism did not tolerate opposition and is commonly compared to Nazism and fascism in many ways, especially involving ethnic pride. The schism between Sunni and Shia Muslims is a long and bloody one, but suffice it to say Saddam and most of the Baathists were Sunni. This disadvantaged Saddam, at least in numbers. About 62% of Iraqis are Shia. Sunnis make up most, about 30 to 34%, with the rest consisting at the time of a small percentage of Christians and Jews, as well as other Muslim and native belief systems. Not being a democratic party, the only way for the Baathists to remain in power was through fear. When Saddam became the power in Iraq by the later 1970s, he set up a cult of personality and a police state that many historians consider totalitarian. It was said that 1/3 of the country was always watching the other 2/3. Saddam had a wide-ranging intelligence and police network. The most feared institution was the Mukhabarat, the secret police and its many branches. From 1978 to 1991, Saddam used a carrot-and-stick approach to ruling. He bribed many and ensured monies and projects were distributed to his core followers, or people he believed could be won over. He used tremendous amounts of oil money in the late 70s and 80s to enrich himself and his close and extended family. He also began a vast military buildup and a costly war with Iran, which had become a Shia-dominated Islamic State in 1979. The war cost upwards of 500,000 lives or more, and ended with the borders and the governments of the two countries remaining precisely the same as before the war. The war did not make Saddam a popular man, and opposition to him increased, partially funded by Iran and Syria. It's important to note that Iran was a bitter enemy of the United States, and that the US had sent millions of dollars in weapons to support Saddam in his struggle against Iran. Donald Rumsfeld, who would serve in both Bush administrations, visited Iraq and, on at least one famous occasion, met with Saddam and shook his hand. In 2003, Rumsfeld would be Secretary of Defense, spearheading the effort to invade Iraq and topple Saddam. Some of Saddam's oldest and most dedicated enemies were religious leaders. One of them was the Shia leader Mohammad Sadiq al-Sadr, father of the leader of one of today's most powerful political and religious groups in Iraq. Al-Sadr and his followers wanted to set up a government based on the teachings of Islam, something which the Baathists, and especially Saddam and his family, now holding immense power and wealth in their hands, were vehemently opposed to. Once Saddam had control of the police and the military, opponents and dissidents began to be killed, many of them publicly. At the beginning, these killings were somewhat limited and targeted. A man would be gunned down in the street by the police, or Baathist spies close to the target would take him out. This was the case with al-Sadr, who was killed along with 2 of his sons in a drive-by shooting as they were leaving a mosque. This had the effect of increasing divisions within Iraq between the 2 main Muslim sects, religious figures, and the regime, and also within large and complicated clan relationships. This killing and others caused many people to flee the country and criticize and oppose this regime from overseas. That's when things got really bad. Saddam began ordering the kidnapping and punishment of family members of overseas opposition figures in an attempt to silence them. Wives were sexually assaulted, sometimes in front of their families. These assaults were often videotaped and sent to opposition figures overseas. Amnesty International recorded instances of carts full of eyeless, pale bodies being dropped off at the homes of family members. Anyone suspected of opposition to Saddam was arrested and most often punished. Thousands of people were taken and never seen again. By the late 1980s and early 90s, Saddam's 2 sons, Uday and Qusay, had been given immense power, though the quieter and more menacing Qusay was the real power. He controlled the secret police and many other government organizations, including a large paramilitary and the famous Republican Guard, the elite branch of the military. Uday was thought to be mentally disturbed, an arrogant psychopath who derived pleasure from killing and punishment. Saddam cared for Qusay. He apparently barely tolerated Uday, and at one point was reported to have told a trusted advisor that one day he would kill his son. It's likely that Saddam is the cause of many of his son's problems. After all, when they were teens, he forced them to execute his opponents in front of him. Of course, in 2003, when they were killed in a gunfight by US troops, Saddam acted as if they were the greatest martyrs in the history of the country. Other punishments included sleep deprivation, mock executions, witnessing punishment of innocent family members, electrocution, starvation, beatings, being repeatedly dragged over rough concrete causing cuts and infection, cigarette burns, and worse were only the most popular methods. It seems that the favorite with the secret police was to suspend a victim from a pole behind their knees and by the wrists, and beat the bottom of their feet with a hose or metal bar. This is a stunningly painful form of punishment, but that wasn't all. Some survivors recounted being left like this and punished for 3 days. Many did not survive. After the first Gulf War in 1991 and until the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, Saddam's regime became even more bloody and cruel. Suspected opponents were often arrested and executed publicly, by the sword, and most often by beheading. Many times, those living close to the suspect were ordered out into the street to watch. Those who refused were often killed or arrested and punished as well. The use of poison gas is recognized as a crime against humanity by almost every nation on Earth. But Saddam used it as early as the 1980s against the Iranians, though he didn't become known for it until the infamous Halabja incident of 1988. Halabja is a town in a large majority Kurdish area of northern Iraq, and during the 80s, many independence-minded Kurds rebelled against Saddam's regime. In response, Saddam waged a war of terror on the Kurds, which resulted in many massacres, the most infamous of which was the bombing of Halabja on March 16th, exactly 35 years ago as we write. Iraqi bombers dropped a combination of mustard gas, nerve agents, and chlorine gas on the town of 60,000 people. 5,000 people died within days. Another 10,000 more were blinded, maimed, disfigured, or damaged internally by the gas. It was amid the outcry over the Halabja massacre that the United States began opposing Saddam rather than aiding his effort against Iran. After the first Gulf War, Saddam ordered gas attacks in the south of the country against the Shia Marsh Arabs, a minority cultural group whose people had lived in the marshes of southern Iraq for thousands of years. Saddam wished to punish the Marsh Arabs because of the uprising against him during the First Gulf War. Not only did he use gas and bullets, but he destroyed the rice crop, killed or stole cattle, and prevented other food from going into the area. Starvation became common. Worse still, he drained the marshes, which turned the area into a desert and caused many Marsh Arabs to flee the country. Others still were arrested, killed, or moved to other parts of Iraq. In a couple of years, Saddam had erased 2,000 years or more of history. Today, however, water has been redirected and many Marsh Arabs have returned to the area. But Saddam is said to have killed or forced out over 1/3 of the people. And all of that is why, after his discovery in a hole in the ground in 2003, Saddam was found guilty by an Iranian tribunal and hanged. Some people were outraged that it was televised. Many cheered. This is History on Fleek, and we'll see you next time.